Episode 32, Visions in Conflict. Welcome to the Hidden and Distorted History of the Church series, where we will be looking at the historical aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. In this series, I will try and inform those unaware of the true facts of Mormon history. Last week, we dived headfirst into the Church's earliest denials of polygamy. We uncovered how the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants was updated and revised with a startling twist: the retroactive insertion of the supposed visitation of Peter, James, and John into D&C 27. And the Whitmers didn't stay quiet about it. They speak out, raising serious questions. In this episode, we're revisiting pivotal and often glossed over moments in early LDS history. From the enigmatic Joshua the Jew, a.k.a. Robert Matthias, to the questioning Erastus Holmes, we'll uncover contradictions in Joseph Smith's first vision accounts. We'll also dive into Joseph's controversial commandments regarding wives' submission, along with his decision to marry Newel Knight to the undivorced Lydia Goldthwaite. Do not miss this one at all. Part 1, Revisiting Robert Matthias, a.k.a. Joshua the Jew. We covered Robert Matthias in the Four Visions back in Episode 4, but this incident fits directly into today's timeline and reveals something important about Joseph Smith's evolving first vision story. In November 1835, Joseph Smith recounted his first vision to his scribe Warren Parrish during a visit with Robert Matthias, a self-proclaimed Prophet Matthias from New York, notorious for his eccentric religious beliefs and run-ins with the law. Matthias came to Kirtland not for casual curiosity, but to size up Smith's prophetic claims against his own. This meeting, then, was no minor interaction. It was a strategic encounter where Smith presented himself as a legitimate prophet in a way that would bolster his authority over someone as controversial as Matthias. For Matthias, Smith provided an elaborate account. He spoke of first seeing God, then Jesus, accompanied by a host of angels, a grand scene meant to validate his prophetic calling. And yet, the Church's official narratives often omit Matthias's name and Parrish's role in recording it, leaving an impression of this version as more polished and timeless than it really was. This omission sidesteps the specific way Smith curated his story, emphasizing only what he needed to in the moment to differentiate himself from Matthias. But what makes this account so interesting isn't just Matthias's involvement. It's how Smith's story shifts just a week later, when he tells a much simpler version to someone else. And this second telling raises serious questions about the reliability of Smith's visions. Part 2, Holmes gets a different answer. A week after his encounter with Matthias, Joseph was approached by Erastus Holmes, a farmer and inquiring outsider who seemed far less sensational than Matthias. Holmes's questions were earnest, his demeanor calm, and he simply wanted to know more about Smith's experiences that had inspired such a movement. But what Holmes received from Smith was, curiously, a simpler and significantly different vision. In this second account, recorded in Smith's journal, he described how he went into the woods as a young man, troubled by the divisions among denominations. This time, however, he spoke of only one divine messenger, an angel, who forgave him and warned against all existing churches as corrupt. Gone was the dramatic procession of God, Jesus, and angels that Smith had shared with Matthias just a week earlier. Key points to note: forgiveness and denomination condemnation. Smith's message to Holmes focused on forgiveness and a denunciation of all churches. Although this message aligns with later accounts, it lacks key details found in his other accounts. Specifically, there's no mention of God and Jesus appearing together. Single divine messenger versus the full cast. This version's omission of both God and Jesus is significant. Only one messenger, a lone angel, visits him in this telling, directly contradicting what he had just told Matthias. Why would Smith's vision of the heavenly assembly, seen just a week before, suddenly reduce to a lone messenger? This inconsistency begs the question: was Smith adjusting the story based on who was listening? Religious confusion as motivation. As with other versions, Smith pointed to his quest for answers amidst denominational strife. Yet here, the vision seems more tailored to Holmes's straightforward curiosity, presenting a simpler, more accessible message rather than a full display of divine figures. This meeting with Holmes reveals a first vision that is less complex and more flexible, reflecting a simpler narrative that eventually evolved to carry more theological weight as Smith's movement grew. The dramatic divine assembly shared with Matthias, trimmed down to a singular angel for Holmes, suggests that the foundational story was malleable, adapted to each audience rather than fixed in one concrete vision. Bluntly put, the differences between these accounts are more than inconsistencies. They illustrate how the first vision was not yet a rigid doctrine, but a tale that shifted to suit the moment. Joseph Smith's meetings with Holmes and Matthias shows a version of the first vision that, like clay, was still being molded. It wasn't yet the story that later would form the bedrock of LDS theology. Rather, it was a narrative taking on new layers, fitting itself to the immediate needs and expectations of a movement still defining itself. Part 3. Submitting the Wives. In November of 1835, Joseph Smith's Wives, Submit Yourselves unto Your Own Husbands revelation is generally tied to the early teachings of the LDS Church on marriage roles found in Section 101 of the D&C, where he drew upon biblical concepts emphasizing patriarchal authority within the household. This revelation, believed to reflect the language of Ephesians 5:22-23, aligns with a doctrine stating that the husband is the spiritual head of the household and places wives in a role of submission to their husbands as part of a divinely ordered family structure. Within this context, Joseph's revelation provided a theological justification for this patriarchal structure, which was integral to the LDS doctrine of exaltation and eternal family order. In practice, the teachings reinforced the idea that a woman's spiritual salvation was closely linked to her adherence to her husband's guidance, a stance that became foundational to LDS teachings about marriage and family governance. The Church encouraged women to view their role as supportive and subordinate, essential for the fulfillment of their husband's priesthood responsibilities, and ultimately for the exaltation of the entire family unit. These teachings, particularly as they relate to polygamy, also stirred considerable conflict within the Church and with the broader public. Emma was notably opposed to the polygamous doctrine, and her resistance created tension within their marriage and the church community. Emma's resistance, alongside societal backlash, highlighted the divisive nature of Smith's marital doctrines and foreshadowed future controversies around the role of women in the church. Over time, the LDS Church adapted its stance on women's submission, especially after the official end of polygamy in 1890. Though modern teachings claim a shift from outright submission to equal partnership between spouses, echoes of Joseph Smith's original doctrine persist, particularly in the rigid gender roles and authority structures upheld by the Church. The concept of male leadership remains entrenched. As the priesthood holder, a husband retains ultimate authority in the home, a position his wife, who is denied the priesthood, cannot assume. Despite language suggesting equality, the priesthood framework ensures that in practice, the man has final say, reinforcing the hierarchical structure that Smith originally instituted. Part 4. Breaking the Law, Illegal Marriages. M. Scott Bradshaw highlights a critical point. During the 1830s, ministers from a wide range of Christian denominations performed marriages in Ohio. Representatives from at least a dozen religious denominations were actively solemnizing marriages, including Anabaptists, Baptists, Congregationalists, Disciples of Christ, Episcopalians, Evangelicals, German Reformed, Mennonites, Methodists, Presbyterians, Unitarians, Universalists, and, of particular interest to readers here, Latter-day Saints. Why would this be of particular interest? Because, despite this open field of denominations authorized to perform marriages, Sidney Rigdon, a prominent leader of the Latter-day Saints, was indicted in 1835 for the unlawful marriage of Orson Hyde to 16-year-old Marinda Nancy Johnson in 1834. The question is, what made this marriage illegal? Was it Marinda's age? No, it was far more complex. Bradshaw continues, most of these ceremonies were performed under a provision of Ohio law that prescribed procedures through which any ordained minister could be licensed to solemnize marriages. A minister merely needed to appear before a county court and produce credentials of his being a regular ordained minister of any religious society or congregation. The statute provided that, once granted, such licenses were to be valid for as long as the minister continued serving the same denomination. This becomes a major problem for Rigdon. Having left the Campbellite movement for Mormonism, he and his followers were no longer credentialed as legitimate ministers under Campbell, making any marriages they performed legally invalid. Yet, Rigdon escaped conviction on a technicality. He was still listed in the Campbellite records, providing a narrow legal loophole. Bradshaw catches this loophole as well. This newspaper report is helpful. First, it explains that at least a partial trial took place. It confirms that the prosecutor knew that Rigdon was no longer a Campbellite minister and in fact was a Mormon minister. The Ohio Marriage Act specifically provided that a license was only valid so long as he shall continue a regular minister in such society or congregation. While the prosecutor was not successful, Rigdon and Smith would understand that another legal avenue for marrying was necessary. But for Joseph Smith, the search for legal permission wasn't pressing, as his own actions would soon demonstrate. Just months later, on November 24, 1835, Joseph performed the marriage of Newel Knight to Lydia Goldthwaite, who was still legally married. Despite Rigdon's recent brush with the law and the lack of a proper marriage license, Joseph disregarded these obstacles, and the ceremony proceeded unlawfully. Knight's journals tell us Lydia initially resisted, unsure of her husband's whereabouts and feeling unable to remarry, believing herself still bound by her marriage. Although Bradshaw asserts evidence surfaced in 2003, indicating Lydia's husband had died in 1833, verification remains inconclusive. Regardless, Joseph had no legal grounds to perform their marriage, making it void under Ohio law, and this incident was not isolated. Between then and June 1837, Smith would go on to conduct 10 more unauthorized marriages, each legally questionable, as if operating above the laws that others were held to. Bradshaw recounts, Joseph's decision to perform marriages apparently surprised some of the saints. This is evident from the accounts of the Knight-Bailey wedding. Lydia's history states that Joseph's brother Hiram was astonished when he learned that Joseph intended to personally marry her and Newel. Probably referring to Sidney Rigdon's legal troubles, Lydia's history explains that Ohio law did not recognize the Mormon elders as ministers, and that LDS elders had been arrested and fined for performing marriages. 11. Newel was also amazed. He noted in his journal that Joseph did not have a license to perform marriages, and that without this the authorities could impose a penalty. Was Knight worried his marriage would not be honored under Ohio law, and thus void in the U.S.? Conclusion. We've uncovered deep contradictions in Joseph Smith's narratives and actions, highlighting early LDS history's complexities. Smith's shifting First Vision accounts, along with his questionable marital teachings and unauthorized marriages, reveal a story shaped by adaptation and personal justification. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.